But everybody's watching what's happening out west because it could be bigger than just wildfires. It could be an impact of climate change, which eventually would have an impact on your stock investments. To help us understand, though, the catastrophe that is unfolding before our eyes, we invite into the stream Steve Bowen. He is Aon meteorologist and head of Catastrophe Insight, joining us from Chicago, Illinois. And the video is remarkable when you see these orange, almost nuclear winter type events in San Francisco in the middle of the day. It's dark and they have to turn on the lights. But we're also seeing towns destroyed in Oregon. And I think we have at least 6 people dead at this point. From an insurance standpoint, how do people recover from this? Because it keeps happening.
Well, obviously, for insurance, the most important component is trying to help people get back on their feet. And unfortunately, with events of this size that we've seen in the past few years, especially in California, is that this is not just a really quick process where we can just sort of flip the switch and people are immediately living in a new home. This is a very long process where we're talking about thousands of properties that have been damaged or destroyed. There is a lot that goes into it in ensuring that we do start to see some of the rebuilding, that we're doing it smart, that we're building properties that are more efficient to these types of large-scale fire disasters, which unfortunately are becoming more frequent. And in fact, right now we're seeing 5 of the top 20 largest fires in California's history since 1932 that are occurring at one time. That's pretty substantial. We're definitely starting to see more of a shift of these larger fires. And unfortunately, they're getting into more of these areas where people are living, and that's leading to catastrophic effects. So from an insurance perspective, all we can do is continue to help people understand the risk and show them that the risk is starting to get a bit worse, and what we can do to help them take steps to ensure their safety.
Steve, this is remarkably similar to the conversation we had with you recently about hurricanes, right? And people moving into coastal areas in higher numbers where they're bigger risk, and all of that being tied up with climate change and the increased risk of these types of natural disasters. If you can, we talked about sort of risk mitigation when it comes to hurricanes as well. Talk to me a little bit more about what that looks like when it comes to fires, because we have record acreage now burned in California this season. The season still has a couple of months to go. So should people be living in different areas? I mean, what you mentioned construction. What does fire-resistant construction look like? Is that even possible?
Sure. So one of the big challenges that we're seeing is people are moving into what we call the wildland-urban interface, which is basically that divide that separates rural and forested areas versus more urbanized areas. And then places like in Paradise, from a couple of years ago, where that's literally built right within the forest themselves. And unfortunately, we're starting to see more and more people moving into these, what we call WUI areas that are high risk for fires, where we know historically fires have occurred, but no one lived there. But now if you add the fires occurring at an even more intense rate and the fire behavior continues to change, it's burning more stuff. And that's not a very good trend. Now, in terms of how you're going to build to ensure that you're protecting yourselves, there's a lot of things you can do. You don't put brush around the perimeter of your home. Use things like rocks. Make sure there's several feet separating any type of brush or tree overhang that could lead to ember spray onto your roof. There's different types of materials that can be used to ensure that it's a bit more, it's a bit less flammable, that may be more resistant. But unfortunately, if you are in the direct path of some of these things, there's very little you can do, because we're talking fire temperatures that are thousands of degrees, which can just burn through pretty much anything. So it's a very, very scary peril. We've talked to firefighters on the ground over the past few years, and they all acknowledge that the fire behavior has definitely changed in the past decade or so.
Steve, it's Julia LaRoche. And of course, Julie had just mentioned we had you not too long ago talking about Hurricane Laura and some of the risks there. And now these fires of historic proportion. If we could just step back and look at 2020, I would just be curious from your vantage point, how some of these disasters that we're seeing kind of stack up in years past that you've been in your role.
It's definitely changed. It's definitely changed. And I would say it's not just wildfire, in which we are seeing more of these larger scale events. It's around severe convective storm, which is basically a fancy word for thunderstorm, where in terms of tornado, hail, damage, straight line wind damage. I mean, this year we're talking a record number of billion-dollar disasters for thunderstorms, which I think a lot of folks probably would be surprised to hear that. and you add into the fact that we are seeing hurricane events that are, of course, we talked about before, hitting increasingly populated areas and expensive areas, we're seeing many more of these high dollar loss costs that are becoming a bit more challenging for everyone to realize. So it's going to take a lot of education to understand that it's the physical science is changing as we're dealing with climate change and how that's having an influence on larger and more intense events, and you're combining that with the fact that we continue to put ourselves more in harm's way. That's not a good combination for increased risk. So in my time that I've been with Aon, I have absolutely seen a shift in the overall cost of these events, and the frequency of these high dollar cost events continue to grow. And it's not just the US, we're seeing this globally as well.
So, Steve, you would expect, some of us believe, the market would disincentivize people from taking these risks, because one would assume insurers would charge more if you're going to be in a risky area. It doesn't seem to happen, though. Is there a concern from the business side of the insurance industry that government might step in and say you can't rebuild anymore in, say, for instance, the hurricane flood zones, or now in the forest when it's prone to forest fires?
Well, there's definitely a growing collaboration between the public and private sectors to try to identify these really high risk areas, to figure out ways to help people, because you can't just tell someone, okay, you got to move out of your neighborhood and have nowhere to go. So there has to be some incentivized program that's going to allow people to reasonably move into these safer areas, but it's just not that simple. We're talking a pretty substantial amount of money that would be required to do it. So, and again, it's not just the new construction that there needs to be focus on. It's what do you do with the stuff that's already there right now? And unfortunately, there's no simple solution to this. But as I mentioned before, there are some initial steps that are being taken to identify these high risk areas and ensure that that people do have an opportunity to buy insurance. You're not pricing them out completely, but also making sure that there are going to be some protections in play, that when people, if they don't have enough insurance, that's another topic we haven't discussed about, is underinsurance, to make sure that people do have some financial component to be able to get their lives back in order. Because as we've seen, between floods, fires, thunderstorms, hurricanes, everything, things are becoming a bit more risky, and we need to identify ways to lower that risk.
That would be a great reason for us to invite you back to this program in the near future to talk about underinsurance and those issues. But now we have to say thank you very much. Steve Bowen is Aon's meteorologist and head of Catastrophe Insight.